Back in 1977, in the small suburb of Enfield, London, some serious violent high strangeness went down, and the Hodgson's family's lives descended into a living hell. 2 of the girls of the 4 children seem to be the focus of a poltergeist, and this case has actually gone down as easily one of the most well-known poltergeist cases ever. The Enfield Poltergeist has a lot in common with other related poltergeist accounts, such as random knockings, doors, and cupboards opening and closing on their own, stuff moving around on its own like household items or even furniture, you name it. If it's been reported before in any other poltergeist case, then it happened in Enfield. But what makes this case unique is that it happened over years, with a ton of witnesses, including neighbors, technicians, reporters, and even the police. In fact, the first time a policeman was called over to the house, he witnessed a chair move across the room on its own. After investigating and trying to find a wire or something, the policeman was baffled because he couldn't explain what he saw, even stating this in his official report. And despite what skeptics say, this is one of the things that gives this case a lot of credibility, because a lot of these witnesses had nothing to gain and a lot to lose by admitting to seeing this paranormal phenomena, especially the police officers. Later in the case, Janet, one of the young girls, would admit to playing with a Ouija board before all the phenomena began, which is kind of cliche, but there you go. The Society of Psychic Research, and yes, it is a real organization, conducted an investigation into the Enfield case. Maurice Gross, a wealthy and successful inventor, initiated this research into the poltergeist activity on behalf of the organization. An author and paranormal investigator also joined in on the fun. His name was Guy Playfair, who actually would go on to write a pretty successful book on the subject called This House is Haunted, which is highly accurate and one of the sole objective sources on what actually went down in Enfield. The whole thing began for the family like most of these stories do, with very light paranormal activity. Just some knocks and stuff here and there, things moving around the girls' room at night, basic spooky happenings. Then the knocks seemed to follow the parents around the house, but no one could ever find the origin of where they were coming from. And it was after this that the poltergeist activity only increased, as well as there being no shortage of witnesses to the anomalies. Law enforcement interviewed over 30 people swearing to have witnessed the paranormal activity, with even the officers themselves making official statements, though most have since refused to talk about it or accept any offers for interviews, which makes sense because it could have meant the end of their careers. And the anomalous activity only seemed to increase as the investigation went on, with the investigators seeing marbles that just flew across the air and landed without rolling, doors, drawers opening up right in front of them, and small objects move without anybody touching them. The 2 young girls that the poltergeist seemed to be attached to would lift them up, seeming to levitate above their beds, and objects would materialize out of thin air. Fires would randomly ignite, and pools of water would materialize out of nowhere. It got to the point where children were forced to take Valium regularly, just to sleep at night. But despite all the horrifying paranormal activity, the saddest part was that the impoverished family were ostracized by their community. All their claims of being haunted and their pleas for help, it really just gained them nothing but contempt by the majority who heard of their nightmarish situation. And I find it odd that this seems to be pretty common among prolific cases of anomalous activity. But it does just go to show that if you shake the tiny box that people accept as their reality, they will attack you for it. However, as if things weren't creepy enough, after about 3 months into the investigation, a disturbing voice began to emanate from one of the young girls, Janet. At first it was bestial, but eventually started to sound like something human, though gruff, harsh, and guttural, in a way young Janet couldn't mimic of her own accord. The voice gradually began to identify itself when questioned, saying it was Joe Wilkins, who had died in the house as the previous owner. This was unknown to the family at the time, and they were very upset that the real estate company didn't tell them that a death had taken place in the home. The voice of Joe spoke through Janet and said he wasn't dead and that he slept in her bed. But the voice seemed to be maybe confused at who it was too, because it also called itself many other names, including Bill, and it seemed to have a dark sense of humor and would mess with the investigators when being questioned. A doctor was called and it was confirmed that the voice was not coming from the girl's larynx, but the vocal fold, which is above the larynx and only used when someone loses their voice, which is impossible to replicate on one's own without specific training. And another bizarre aspect is that if somebody is talking with their vocal fold, it always causes the throat to become damaged. However, after the young girl was done channeling the entity's voice, she never had a sore throat, which makes no sense at all because sometimes the phantom voice emanating from her would speak up to 3 hours at a time. It is objectively and literally impossible to talk that long with the vocal fold without losing your voice. But every single time the young girl was done channeling the entity, she could speak perfectly fine as if nothing ever happened. The voice even continued to speak even if Janet's mouth was taped shut, or her mouth was filled with water. Later, even her sister Margaret would speak with Joe's voice, though with less intensity or duration. Tons of people were brought in to test the authenticity of Janet's alleged channeling, and none were able to prove it false or even explain it. And I mean experts from all over the world. Mediums and psychics were brought in to help investigate the anomalous activity, with all of them sharing their own perceptions of what was going down, but no one could really put a finger on it. One psychic, Matthew Manning, claimed that the phenomena was being generated by the young girl's own energy. Though a ghost may latch onto such, it still came from the girls themselves. Manning claimed that all poltergeist activity is generated in this way and that it can be a beacon to entities not of this world, or that even poltergeist activity is generated by the girl's own subconscious and latent psychic powers. Interestingly enough, eventually famed paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren showed up. They were brought in to gauge if there was any demonic activity in the house, but they were latecomers to the party. Despite some misconceptions, they actually played a far less role than the other investigators, which is kind of confusing because in the movie The Conjuring 2, it's the Warrens who are shown as the main investigators and the heroes of the story. In truth, the Warrens were only there for a handful of days, but they did have a hand to play in the craziness nonetheless. For around 18 months, the family was traumatized by the poltergeist and never benefited financially in any way. The whole case almost totally destroyed the family's lives and permanently psychologically damaged them. To this day, many who were involved in the case refuse to talk about it, especially the family other than Janet. But the Enfield Poltergeist is easily the most well-documented and objective poltergeist case in the history of paranormal research.